Isabel, thank you. Now, net migration to the UK has plummeted by more than 100,000 since the vote for Brexit. But this morning on Sunrise, we're asking if it's still too high. Well, for our talking point this morning, we can cross to our central London studios and chat to the European political commentator Nina Schick and former advisor to Nigel Farage, Michael Heaver. Good morning to both of you. Michael, we're still way above the tens of thousands that was talked about you know, in the elections in 2010 and 2015, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite something when you talk about 230,000 net migration as a lower number. Interestingly, the government's projections moving forward for a high migration scenario are at 230,000 net a year, and under that scenario, 45% of new homes being built until 2039 would be required just for migrants and their families. This is still a huge number, a huge number. And you look at A&E, you look at the housing waiting list, you look at hospitals, all of these things are being driven by massive population growth, being fuelled by mass migration. Politicians here in Westminster don't want to talk about it, but it's what drove that Leave vote in the Brexit referendum. This is the defining issue of our age. Are we going to get population growth and mass migration under control, or are we going to continue to let it run totally out of control, totally burden our public services and ruin the quality of life and the pay packets for British workers? It cannot go on like this. It has to be brought down to tens of thousands. And I note that, you know, when it comes to Brexit, politicians are very quietly on this. Just one statistic to give you for people to think about here. The current projections are that for England alone, 5.9% population growth between 2016 and 2026. In a decade, England's population is set to go up 6%. It's going to be largely concentrated in London and the south of England. Just imagine the burden that that's going to add to our already stretched housing, hospitals, schools, roads, all the rest of it. It's completely irresponsible. They need to get a grip on it, and fast.
So, Nina, a drop of 100,000, is that then, in your view, a step in the right direction?
Well, obviously it's tied into the Brexit vote, but on that hundreds of thousands target, which was basically an arbitrary figure which was sketched on the back of an envelope, it was never going to be met. And the idea that immigration is too high is a valid one. And if this country voted to bring down immigration, that's perfectly fine. But then what you have to inject into the debate is what is the consequence of that going to be? And we know that actually migrants are a net benefactor to the coffers of the Treasury, 7 billion a year. So of course, if there is less immigration, less tax income, that means less money for public services, less money for infrastructure. The idea that it's immigrants causing NHS waiting times, causing pressure on schools is a very popular one in the public discourse. However, there is no evidence to suggest that that's actually true. The same goes for jobs. So the idea that there's somehow a fixed number of jobs in the British economy and migrants are taking away from British workers is nonsensical.
They are much easier to exploit in terms of conditions, in terms of hours and everything else. And I came up against, Kevin, an example of this in 2009. I was out campaigning outside Peterborough Cathedral, and I met a 16-year-old girl who'd applied for a job on a packing line, you know, where they get broccoli and they put cellophane round it, and it involved quite a lot of hydraulics and moving parts. And she told me she didn't get the job because she couldn't speak Polish, and there was a hell of a row.
Because if you look at the migration figures from last year, where it was at its highest ever, you also see unemployment at its lowest ever. The more people there are, the more demand there is for services, the more jobs are actually created. So a lot of these things, a lot of these frustrations, which are valid, which Michael pointed out, have to do with failure on the part of government policy and not migrants. In fact, if you look at EU migrants, who account for a big decline in the figures this year, on average, they tend to be twice as likely to be more educated than British workers. So they are coming here, like myself, you know, make a pact to this country to work here, pay taxes, and not come as somehow benefits scroungers or to come here for the NHS. I mean, those are myths that need to be, actually, there's no evidence.
There are demands all over Wandsworth. Nearly half the inmates are foreign, and many can't speak English.
Are you from Romania? Romania?
So many Romanians.
I'm from Romania, Bucharest.
Like Nikolai and Raduta. They say they've served their time but are waiting to be deported.
3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, we finished my punishment, let you go home.
Do you want to go back to Romania?
Yes, I want to go back. I don't want to come back here never.
I'm from Romania, but it doesn't matter where you're from. Human rights are human rights.
Because I don't have hot water, no TV.
But not everyone wants to go home. This is Giyasel,
There is very worse in this prison.
unhappy with his room, but proud of his crimes.
What were you in for?
Pickpocketing.
How much were you stealing a day?
2,000 or 3,000 per day.
£3,000 per day out of people's pockets?
Yeah. And I'm feeling proud of it.
You're proud of it?
Yeah, I'm gonna do it again.
What, here in the UK?
I might come here in UK as well. I don't know how, but I'm gonna try and come here again.
To pickpocket?
Yeah, because here you make a lot of money.
Astonishing stories.
Is Michael right in his argument when he says, you know, whatever your sort of view of immigrants is per se, if you've got more people coming over, then that does put more pressure on housing, NHS, education?
So my point again is that if we connect the dots here, if migrants are net contributors financially, then that means that there's more money for public services. So again, I'm saying that the failure, so where there is pressure on public services, schooling, houses, is far more to do with the failure of government policy rather than migration. So that is the real link. There is no body of evidence, and I'd be interested to know if Michael can quote any that suggests that there's a direct link between strain on public services and migrants.
OK, there you go, Michael. That's the challenge.
Well, look, the fact is population increased, the last set of figures, 538,000 in a year, right? 62% of that was from net migration. I don't blame migrants at all, right? They're coming to earn a pound note. Good luck to them. They're grafting. I blame the politicians. The fact, if you want to talk about consequences, I think this is the most underreported story of this year. Let's look at what the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee are now saying. They're saying that a tightening labour market, for the first time they're seeing starting salaries rise. You've also seen the Recruitment and Employment Confederation say the same, that starting salaries are starting to go up because you've not got such a big supply of unskilled labour coming into the market. And guess what? Workers will start to have to be paid more. All those lads and ladies that went to the ballot box and voted Brexit, you are now starting to see the impact of that. You're going to start to see salaries going up. And at Sky News this week, they had a construction manager you guys spoke to who basically said 80% of my workforce is foreign at the minute. With Brexit, if migration goes down, guess what? I'm going to have to check British workers a bob or two more. You know, this is great stuff for British workers. It's supply and demand, isn't it, at the end of the day? Yeah, if you add population growth...
But in terms, I mean, you mentioned unskilled labour, and that is an issue. But what about the skilled labour? And we know, you know, the percentage of people from the EU and elsewhere who make up our doctors and nurses in the NHS. I mean, there is a potential problem here, isn't there?
No, because I think you just have a system where skilled labour comes in. But I do think as a country as well, we need to seriously look at the fact of why we got 790,000 16 to 24-year-olds in this country who aren't in employment, education or training. I think it's because we basically created a cheap labour economy whereby we've essentially not given businesses any incentive whatsoever to invest in training. You know, people that want to train to be nurses in this country, they're not getting the opportunities because why would you invest when you can bring in ready-made, trained, cheap labour? And I'm afraid it's the young people of this country, particularly working class people, who have suffered because businesses are not incentivised to go out, recruit them actively, pay them a bit more money, invest in training and get them in the job market. There's no incentive because you've got an endless open door to cheap labour. I'm afraid businesses aren't going to do that. And that needs to change. And as I say, when you talk about public services, 538,000 population increase, over 500,000 in 1 year. How can you build enough hospitals, schools, houses and all the rest of it? It's totally unrealistic. This damages people's quality of life. It impacts their families. It needs to end. We need tens of thousands net migration. The government promised to do it. They need to get on with it. Enough talk. Let's have some action.
I think we could have done with about 30 minutes for this discussion. Michael and Nina, we've got to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed.